Okay, so we're now into the third and final part of this lecture, where we take up the issue of poverty and dependency. This is the conundrum that we have as a policy matter. We're trying to address this issue of poverty, but there's a related issue that we need to address, and that's dependency. So let's just think through this for a minute here. So we're trying to address poverty on the one hand. If all we care about is poverty, we could certainly address this issue. We have the means to address this issue. I give you some basic numbers. These numbers are a little bit outdated, but just follow along in terms of the logic. So if we're trying to address poverty, all we would have to do, I'm making it seem a lot simpler than it is maybe, but what we would have to do is think about what the gaps are, right? You'd have maybe break the population up into three different groups, age groups. You have elderly, you have kids, and then you have the working age population. And we have to figure out what the poverty gap is. That is the amount of income or the amount of resources that people hold relative to the threshold that we want people at on an aggregate level. And so that gap, these are the numbers from 2002, but the poverty gap for the elderly population is at 8 billion. We would need to fill that gap to bring everyone up to the poverty level. We would need to fill the gap up for kids, which was at 20 billion as of 2002, and then another 22 billion for the working age population. And we brought our entire population up to poverty. We've addressed poverty, but of course that doesn't address dependency. We may be fostering dependency if we simply provide some sort of cash grant to all segments of our population. And so if all we care about, on the other hand, is dependency, then you could just end all assistance programs, right? You could just get rid of any sort of public program that provides assistance to the poor, and you've eliminated dependency. But what we're trying to do is balance these two issues, right? If you want to address both poverty and dependency simultaneously, if you want to balance these two, then historically, this is a historical matter, what the government has done in the past is use something called an earnings disregard. Right, so this is what we're trying to understand in the section how the earnings disregard actually works. Take this hypothetical here. Let's say we have a family of three. We have a family of three, and we want to bring this family of three up to the poverty level, which we said for 2013, the poverty threshold for a family of three is $18,552. And so just for ease of calculation, we'll figure how much this family needs. On a monthly basis, that family needs $1,500, $1,546 actually, but we'll just round. So $1,500 on a monthly basis to bring all families of three up to the poverty line. Right, so we could, if we wanted to address poverty, we would simply make sure all families were at the poverty line of $1,546 a month. But you think about, well, what about the work effort, right? That's what our related concern is about dependency and efficiency. Would that still promote work? Well, let's consider what we would have to do. Three different scenarios here. You have a family that doesn't work at all. We would, as a government matter, that this hypothetical policy would have to provide that family with $1,500 to bring them up to the poverty line. That's how we would address this first family here. We have a second family. They're in fact working. They're making $1,000. They seem to be working hard, but they still have a gap, $500. And so, as a policy response, government would have to provide this family with $500. And then you have a third family making $1,500 or more, and government wouldn't have to do anything. Right? We've addressed poverty. If we establish a basic grant to bring everyone up to poverty, we've addressed poverty, but we really haven't done anything about the work effort, right? If that's the way that we design our policies, because this family takes a look at this family and says, well, we're working very hard for our money, but this family didn't work at all, and the government brings them up to $1,500. This family is thinking similarly, saying, well, we're working hard and we're not making ends meet. We're at $1,000, but we could just simply do nothing and the government will still bring us up to poverty. So we haven't addressed dependency is the basic point here. If all we're trying to do is fill the gaps. And so we have the earnings disregard, right? And so basically the way the earnings disregard works is we're being very literal here in that where the government is literally disregarding a certain percentage of what a family made with the purpose of providing a little bit of a boost or work incentive is underlying this earnings disregard. And so once again, we have the three different scenarios. You had the family that didn't work at all. The family that didn't work at all, we don't want to provide any sort of incentive for this family because it didn't work, so we simply give them $1,500. We give them the basic grant of $1,500, so their total take-home pay, this family, is $1,500. We had the second family, recall, that earned $1,000. This family was working hard, and so this is where the earnings disregard kicks in. The government says, we're going to disregard, we're going to assume a 50% disregard, just for ease of calculation here. Assuming a 50% disregard, the government says, we're going to disregard 50% of what you made when we calculate your grant amount. And so the government will disregard $500 when calculating the grant. And so the actual amount of earnings that the government takes into account when calculating the grant here is $500. In other words, the countable earnings is the wording that I use here. The countable earnings is $500. And so to figure the basic grant amount for this family, we take the maximum grant allowable, which is $1,500, minus $1,500 minus the countable earnings of $500. And so this, the grant amount for this family is going to come out to $1,000. So if you think about this family's overall well-being, they worked hard, they earned $1,000. The government provides a boost via the earnings disregard of 50%, and this family's total take-home pay after the basic grant is going to be $2,000 as opposed to $1,500 before. We could have just given this family $500 and brought them up to the poverty line, but we implemented the disregard and we brought them all the way up to $2,000. So one more example here. You have a family that earns $1,200. So once again, assuming a 50% disregard, the government disregards $600 of what this family made when calculating the grant. And so the actual amount of earnings that the government considers when calculating the grant is $600. And when calculating the grant, it's the maximum grant minus the countable earnings is the grant amount of $900. And so recall that the family initially made $1,200. The government gives this family $900 after applying this earnings disregard. And so the total take-home pay for this family is $2,100 and not $1,500. We could have given this family $300, brought them up to poverty, but we implemented the earnings disregard and make them a little bit better off, give them a benefit, give them a little bit of a boost for the hard work they put in. Now, at this point, those in face-to-face classes, I would have them run through this calculation here just to make sure they understand how this earnings disregard works. So suppose that we have a family of three that makes $1,600. Right, this family is at $1,600, and so recall that we're just trying to bring families up to $1,500. They're already at $1,500. How do we address this family is the last of the issues here. And so if we stop people at $1,500, we may have a problem, is what I'm trying to introduce here. If we let them go above $1,500 and still receive the grant, that's the dilemma here. Do we stop people at $1,500 or do we allow people to go above $1,500 is the basic problem, okay? And so what happens if we simply cut people off at $1,500, we have something called the cliff effect. So if you have a family that earns $1,499, they're right at that threshold. Their total take-home pay after applying the disregard, they would take home $2,249.50, but for earning one additional dollar, this family that earned one additional dollar, they earned $1,500, would be cut off from the grant, right? If we designed a program such that we cut people off right at the threshold amount. And so you can see where the cliff effect comes in. For earning one additional dollar, this $1,500 family has lost $750 in the way of a basic grant, right? That doesn't seem to be very fair, right? We had a $1,499 family and we have a $1,500 family, and the total take-home pay is quite different here is what we're showing if we simply cut people off. And so we have to make a decision here. We're left with another conundrum about how we design our policies. Do we cut people off at the threshold or do we go above? And as a practical matter in the US, in our policies, we've historically allowed families to go above the thresholds to avoid this cliff effect. Most notably, if we think about the way supplemental security income or SSI operates, the way our welfare system operates, they both impose 50% disregards today. And so just keep that in the back of your mind as you think about how one becomes eligible for all the different programs that we'll look into in the second half of the semester. All right, so that concludes this lecture on poverty. And so next week, we're discussing the basic structural components of different policies and programs and what to look for when examining a social welfare policy or program.